Good afternoon and welcome to today's CTL webinar, Creating Connections, Promoting Collaborative Learning. Our presenters today are Dr. Jenny Sue Flanagan and Dr. A.J. Nolte. Jenny Sue Flanagan is an associate professor in and the director of the Martinson Center for Mathematics and Science at Regent University. Prior to coming on full-time at Regent, Jenny Sue was an adjunct in the Interdisciplinary Studies program for Regent's College of Arts and Sciences and was the elementary science coordinator for Virginia Beach City Public Schools, where she developed curriculum and professional development programs for K-5 teachers. She also taught as the middle school science coordinator for the division and taught science in grades 6 through 12. Additionally, Dr. Flanagan has developed and taught professional development courses on how to create engaging classrooms. Dr. Flanagan earned her EDD in Education, Adult Learning and Staff Development from Regent University. She holds an Education Specialist degree in Administration and Supervision and a Master's of Education in Curriculum and Instruction, both from the University of Virginia. Andrew J. A.J. Nolte is an Associate Professor at Regent University. Previously, Nolte worked for the Religious Freedom Project at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and at the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University. Before coming to Regent, he was a professor of politics at Messiah College. He also taught at George Washington University, Catholic University, and National Defense University. Dr. Nolte has used active learning and simulations extensively in teaching and presented his work at a teaching and learning panel at the American Political Science Association conference in fall 2017. Dr. Nolte received both his PhD in politics and his MA in world politics from Catholic University of America. If you have questions during the webinar, please type your question into the chat area on the bottom right of your screen. We will have a period of Q&A at the webinar's conclusion, at which point your questions will be addressed. And I'd like to begin our webinar with a brief poll related to collaborative learning. Let me start up a poll. You will see on your screen a question with 4 answers, 4 options. The question is, which of these approaches do you currently favor the most for collaborative learning? The numbers there 1 through 4 correspond to the numbers 1 through 4 on the poll. If you would go ahead and log your results, log your choices. Okay, thank you for your feedback. It looks like Blackboard Collaborate is pretty popular, and group assignments as well. We hope that today you'll be introduced to some helpful strategies that can perhaps inform your own approaches to collaborative teaching and collaborative instruction strategies. As we move through our agenda, we will explore some possibilities with collaborative learning and consider teaching applications and examples of how Regent University's own faculty are using these strategies. And our primary goal today is to share some best practices in collaborative learning, from philosophy to application. Our guests will share some excellent ideas relevant to both face-to-face and online learning environments. At this point, I'd like to transition over to Dr. Flanagan, who will share some of her insights for face-to-face classrooms. Dr. Flanagan?
Thanks, David. So when I started teaching back in 1992, I often like to tell the teachers or the students at Regent that are going into education that I sort of had this extra appendage hooked to me, because back in the day we didn't have fancy projectors or those types of things. We just had overhead projectors, and my typical forte in terms of teaching was I'd start with a lecture, and then we might do something like a science lab, and then we'd have a quiz every week, and maybe there might be one group assignment, but it was pretty much I felt comfortable delivering the information. And as I went through teaching and I progressed through the years, I suddenly realized that I was bored. And if I was bored, I was wondering if my students were bored. And so thankfully had the opportunity to learn a great deal about collaboration and many different strategies. And so over the years, I've really tried to think about my class, whether it's online or face to face, and ask myself, if I were a student in my class, would I be engaged? And as I think about that, I go, okay, what could I do as the instructor to engage my students so that they're actually taking the information, processing it, making sense of it, and I become more of that facilitator on the side, clarifying information and identifying misconceptions and trying to undo those misconceptions. So one of the strategies that I love to use is what you see on the screen called See, Think, Wonder. And what we know from research is that we're seeing a lot of research coming out that's showing that if students are engaged in the learning process from the very beginning, we start to see that their attention, their motivation, they actually start practicing higher level critical thinking skills, and they're really having more meaningful learning experiences. See, Think, Wonder is an active learning strategy really that can be used anywhere. I like to use it at the beginning of a lesson to pique students' curiosity. And basically, this is how it works. You just use a picture. Um, Try and find one that might create an emotional response, or, in history, even if you use lots of propaganda posters, things that make students look at it and go, whoa, what is that? And so you essentially just go, what do you see when you look at this picture? What details stand out? And what do you think is going on? And what makes you say that? And then what does this make you wonder about? Again, this picture here might be used for, say, an introductory lesson on a topic of why people migrate. Why do they leave their countries? Do they always leave because they choose to, or is it necessarily because they have to? And so, again, using a really engaging picture. Another version of the same strategy is what's called an analysis of an image. And you can see the 6 steps in the process. Particularly with this one, when I've used it with students, what I'll do is I'll have them independently go through each step. And then I'll have them do what's called a partner share, that they pair up with someone to the right or to the left of them. Or if I'm using it in an online environment, I will actually set the partners and say that you need to, share your ideas and things that you put, and over the week have a conversation with your partner about this image. Again, it's just one way to get students engaged, and for me as the instructor, I can also see when they give their comments what misconceptions they may have about issues. I might be able to find out what they already know. So in a way, I can use it as a pre-assessment for student understanding what they're bringing into my course, and what things are tied to that topic. Another one that I've used I use this heavily in face-to-face classrooms, is what I like to call the consensus map. And so this strategy for me is something that I might use at the end of a lesson for students to make sense, make meaning of what we've just done in that hour-long session, or if it's a longer piece. Here you can see a math example. And so the way that it works is the 4 areas that you see on the outside of the mat. Each student has their own area to write and to process their thoughts. And as the instructor, I give students about 3 to 4 minutes to process their information, by themselves without talking, which you'll find is hard for some students. I always tell my students that some of them are external processors and some are internal processors. And for those external processors who want to just shout out the answer or start talking with the group, they have to, make sure that they're thinking inside their head, which is often hard for them. But they process in their own square. And then in the centerpiece is where they have to come to consensus on an answer. And to help students formulate their consensus, I like to use what I call round the table type strategy, where each student will go around and they will share what they process out on their map, and everybody has a chance to talk. No one can interrupt. It's not about pointing out flaws in the student's thinking at that point. Only once everybody has had a chance to share can they then start picking apart and working on developing a consensus as a group. I find with students, even with adult learners, that this is really a powerful strategy, because, finding consensus can be hard. And so we have to really listen to each other and listen to what that person is saying, and then put it together with our thoughts and find that happy medium. So consensus map works really, really well, for tying things up together, in a learning situation. And as the instructor, I'm going around and listening to conversations. And then once everybody's had a chance to do their own place, their consensus map, then we can have a group discussion. And I, as the teacher, can sort of go through and make sure that all the students have the points that I want them to walk away with from that day's lesson. The last one I'll just share with you today is one that I've used often for group discussions. And it's called the fishbowl strategy, because it's exactly what it sounds like. You basically have, out of your class, you have two groups, an outer circle and an inner circle. And the students have read a previous article, or they've studied something at home, and when they come into the class situation, the students that are sitting in the circle are the only ones that are allowed to talk. And it's not necessarily, where I'm not trying to give them something where there's a right answer. I want to use an article that allows for lots of discussion. And so that inner circle will be talking about what they've learned. They'll be asking questions, and then they'll be trying to answer. If I'm sitting on the outside of the circle and I want to speak, then what I can do is I can tap someone in the inner circle and I can exchange places with them. So it really allows for great discussions. And then, as the instructor, I could move the inner circle to the outer circle and the outer circle to the inner circle. We can then, at the end of the fishbowl, have a great classroom discussion to kind of look at all of the different perspectives. So this works really, really well, especially if you've got topics in your curriculum that have multiple perspectives, things that have great debates within the topic, so that students can kind of start to have great discussions and so forth. And so those are just three strategies that, like I said, I've used them very heavily in face-to-face classrooms. See, Think, Wonder I've really started to use in online settings, especially when I do my my Regent Live sessions. I'll use that strategy as a way to engage students who are coming on, during our Regent Live pieces. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition to Dr. Nolte. So thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Flanagan. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do with my presentation is I'm just going to articulate sort of some general principles that I've used in terms of collaborative learning. And I've used these both online and on campus, and at the graduate level, undergraduate level, and in professional military education. And then I'm going to talk about two applications, one in terms of using Regents Collaborate, one in terms of an on-campus thing that I've done a lot, which is sort of the use of simulations, which is a form of active learning that's kind of useful for us in the government school. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with a challenge that I'm currently working on, actually with some folks here at CTL, on how to combine those two application strategies to create simulations for the online environment. So overall goals and philosophies for student engagement. I really have just a couple of very broad principles, and I'm sure that these are things that you guys are familiar with, particularly if you've taken FAC 100, because some of this is probably a review for that. So flexibility is the first thing. Meet the online learner where they are, and this is true of on-campus learners as well, in terms of learning style and personal circumstances. All right, so learning style, of course, some people learn by listening, some people learn by seeing, some people learn by doing. And I think one of the things that I found is that a surprising number of people actually learn by doing. And that doing sometimes makes things stick more in your memory. As far as circumstances, when you're talking about online, as all of you know, so you have a wide variety of people coming from different backgrounds, different time zones. So coordinating some of that synchronous face-to-face interaction can be a bit tricky. So you want to be flexible in that sense. Second principle is personal touch. Try to give every learner, online or on campus, but this is particularly tricky for online, opportunities for direct faculty interaction, whether that's face-to-face, whether that's having a policy of sort of quick email responses, being active in some of the forums, particularly the sort of questions and discussion forum. And then the third principle is application. So I try to design student engagement to emphasize real-life applicability of course materials and themes. This is particularly important in the Robertson School, which is our MA in government. You've got a lot of sort of grand theory that goes into, okay, particularly some of the courses I teach, like international relations theory, or I teach a course on Islamic political thought. The question always kind of comes back to, how does this apply? What does this look like in the real world, in real life? And so I try to design assignments and engagement to emphasize that as well. So flexibility, personal touch, applicability. So putting these principles into practice. The first one I want to talk about is use of live collaborate sessions. Some of you may do things similarly to the way that I'm talking about, but from a couple of different faculty I've talked to in different departments, this does seem to be a little bit of a different approach. So in each course, I do live collaborate sessions weekly, and I offer them, and basically function similarly to an on-campus section of the course. So for grad classes, this is usually sort of a seminar-style discussion on course content with a heavy sort of application of faith integration focus. Usually runs for about an hour. I'll give students an opportunity at the beginning for to ask questions in terms of basic administrative stuff, and then move on from there, and we'll sort of talk through any number of issues related to course readings and course themes. So it's really designed to function like a seminar. What may be a little bit different is that at the same time I have discussion questions. I usually do either 1 or 2 discussion questions every week that every student has to do. Some courses have a separate faith integration discussion question and a readings response. In other courses, I just have one. And students are given the option of either doing the live collaborate session or doing a traditional discussion board post. And both of those will count for class participation for that week. Part of the reason I do this is because there's a difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning. And some students learn better by doing things synchronous, by having that face-to-face interaction, having the opportunity to, in a live setting, bounce things off students. Others actually prefer the discussion board posts, or they live in kind of a wonky time zone, so it's difficult for them to make maybe a collaborate that runs at 7 p.m. If you've got somebody who's stationed in the military overseas in Europe or the Horn of Africa or something. So I always have the option for both, and one can substitute for the other. And so giving students, again, that goes back to that issue of flexibility, of giving students the choice of your live collaborate can count for class participation, or you can do discussion board posts for class participation. And then another aspect of this, just from a practical management thing that I do, is at the beginning of the course, so that first week before the semester starts, I'll usually post a survey, probably built on SurveyMonkey, to gauge student interest in collaborate sessions and determine the time with the greatest number of students availability. So basically the survey is, how often would you attend a live collaborate session, and to what extent, and what dates and times during the week generally work best for you. And then you try to pick a fixed time or rotate it between a couple of times, but I generally do try to stick to one time throughout the semester, set collaborates for that time. And that has tended to be, I think, very helpful in just giving students a sense of predictability with it. And also, if you miss a collaborate, if you're out of town or something like that, you can always move back into the discussion board. So generally, I get about half the class opting to participate in live collaborate sessions. So if I've got a class, right now I've got a class of, I think there's 21 in the class, and I'm getting between 11 and 12 students coming to the collaborate sessions. Those who have attended the Collaborate sessions tend to enjoy them, tend to find them pretty beneficial. Of course, anybody who's done social science research will say, yeah, that's a little bit of a self-selecting sample, right? So obviously, if you're regularly attending the Collaborates, you probably enjoy them and find them useful. I have had one student who attended a couple of Collaborates and decided, you know, I really prefer the online discussion board posts. It helps me clarify and organize my thinking a little bit better. And you have some students who are maybe a little bit more reticent to talk. Maybe they're a little bit shyer in person, but more demonstrative in writing. And so I think that flexibility is nice. The one hiccup that I have found with Collab is, and using Collaborate this way, is if you have a very small online class. And I define small as 6 or 7 students or less. Regular participation in those sessions has been sometimes low enough that I've stopped holding them weekly. But where I have a class size of at least 9 or 10, I generally will get pretty good participation. And so, you know, I look at decent participation in a class like that is close to half. You know, so if I've got 9 students and I'm getting, you know, 4 or 5, sometimes, you know, occasionally 3, something like that, that's still pretty good. That's good participation. I've had a couple of collabs this semester where I've only had either one person or nobody shows up. And so, but that's fairly rare. I've only ever had that happen on a regular basis in I think 2 classes, and they were both really small. But particularly if you've got big sections, you could get a pretty substantial participation. I will say 2 things just in terms of mechanics that I've found. This may not be universal. One is that the hand-raising function is very good for sort of organizing Collaborates. It works actually pretty well. And then you just lower the hand and you can kind of go through. I'm doing all of this, by the way, on a screen reader, and I'm not using screen because I'm visually impaired. And actually, the technology from a technical perspective has worked pretty well. The other thing that I found, both for myself and for other students, is that Ultra has tended to work a lot better than Classic for a couple of reasons. I find the Classic sort of launcher, Blackboard launcher, is not my best friend ever. From a technical perspective of just making it work with making the technology work. And if students do want to dial in, because I've had a fair number of students who have said, you know, this is great, I'd love to participate, but, you know, I need to be driving home from work. Can I do this hands-free on my cell phone? And I say yes. It's easier to do that, I've found, and have students dial in if you use Ultra. So those are just some kind of technical aspects. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is just use of simulations. I have this listed as active learning. I think Dr. Flanagan actually gave a pretty good definition of active learning earlier. It's essentially learning by doing, where you're demonstrating the sort of practical aspects, practical applications of theories. You're engaging students with course themes. And the other thing I think that's important is you're creating an experience that students are going to remember. And if you create an experience that students will remember in the classroom, what I found is that material that was discussed or that is related to that experience also sticks in the mind a little bit better. The other thing about simulations is that they're fun. They're fun for students, and they're fun for me as a professor as well. So that's not necessarily something to, I don't know if that has a ton of pedagogical value or not, but it's something that weighs in my mind for sure. So in government classes, when we talk about active learning, we're talking about simulations. And what do I mean by a simulation? Just to give a quick working definition, simulation is where you are given a scenario, you're given or choose roles, and then you have to sort of move through that scenario and see if you can solve it, see if you can work to a solution or something like that. You could think of it as very similar to playing a game. I know that there have been webinars in the past on gamification. This is sort of another form of that, although simulations are a little bit less structured, a little bit more sort of free-flowing, and there's a little bit more room for students to sort of make up their own rules. Give a couple tips on practical. I use simulations extensively. So every on-campus class I've taught, I've used at least one simulation since about 2014, 2015. And sometimes I will use 2 or more, depending on the course themes. So here are a couple of just general rules of thumb and applications that I've used. So when you're choosing a topic for a simulation, it's best to select one, keeping a couple criteria in mind. Large number of potential actors, many competing interests, and complex range of outcomes, right? So you want one where you can have a number of groups that are all interacting. There's a bunch of possible outcomes, and competing interests. Competing interests is really important because, particularly if you're looking at government stuff, international relations stuff, because it genuinely reflects reality. And so you want to make sure that students have a good grasp of, look, people aren't just making these decisions and aren't just unable to solve these problems easily because they're bullheaded or they're not intelligent or something like that. There really are genuinely different competing interests. So I never want my simulation to be too easy because that's not realistic. As far as crafting a scenario, I've used a balance between fictional and real life scenarios in teaching context. And here it kind of depends on what you're looking to get at. I can use real life scenarios when I'm attempting to simulate historical events or the complexity of a region. I use real life scenarios a lot in, for example, when I'm teaching a Middle East course. One of the scenarios that I often use is right after World War I, the sort of Peace of Paris and the Middle Eastern pieces of that, just so that students can see how interest at the time shaped current outcomes. I've done other regions where there are particularly intense or complex regional conflicts. I've done historical-based simulations on that. I think fictional scenarios can be useful when you're dealing with a wicked problem, a really complex problem in a regional context. Sometimes it can be useful to create a scenario of something that hasn't actually happened but could happen in the future. Or you can create something that's completely fiction-based. I've done this a couple of times where I've either made up a country or even set things in a fictional context, fictional TV or even book series context that people are very familiar with. And you do that if you want to make students think outside the box about a particular course theme. Assigning roles, I generally allow students to pick their own roles because you want students that are really going to be engaged in the role that they're in. And it is surprising, although perhaps it shouldn't be, how many students want to play the role that they perceive to be the quote-unquote bad guy in the simulation. There are always, and it's never the students that you expect, which is kind of fun. But the one thing that I do try to do is make sure that there's a relatively equal balance across groups in terms of both people who are very, in terms of raw numbers, and also in terms of people who are going to be very, very active and very assertive in the simulation, because you don't want, you want to sort of balance that as well. Objectives. So it's important to think, pick a topic where there's a genuine conflict of interest. I mentioned that before. But also provide a real, albeit very narrow, pathway to success. And the way to do that sometimes is to provide students with their own objectives and say, you need to accomplish X, Y, and Z. The other team needs to accomplish A, B, and C. Some of those may conflict, some of those may not. And then they have to go in and negotiate and try to get as much of what they're supposed to get as they can, and based on that, try to see if they can come up with a peace solution. I tend to my simulations tend to be very unstructured. They're not turn-based, and there are not a lot of game mechanics. This makes it easier on me because then I have the flexibility to tweak things, add interventions and things like that. I think it also makes it easier on the students because you don't want to have to spend too much time actually learning the mechanics of a simulation. If it takes you half the class to learn to play the game, it makes it more difficult, I think, sometimes to achieve the learning objectives. And then the last part as far as mechanics is I always do a talkback session after the simulation to ask students what they've learned, how the simulation relates to what the topic is and what the course materials are supposed to be. And this is just for me to make sure that I'm not just doing a simulation that's fun and everybody enjoys it, but that they're not learning what they need to learn from the course material. And if they're not learning what they need to learn, then I think about tweaking it or even abandoning it in the future. And so that's kind of a good gauge. And usually what I found is that students are pretty able to clearly articulate some ties in. And usually what they say is, theoretically I understood how things could have worked before. this gave me a little bit more of a practical concept of how things work. All right, last thing I want to talk about is an ongoing challenge. So thus far, I've primarily used simulations in the on-campus context. And so what I'm working on now, and working with some folks here at CTL and kind of thinking about, and would love input from any folks in the webinar if you have sort of thoughts and suggestions on this, is the challenge of figuring out how to adapt some of these simulations for the online environment and for online learners and online learning. So that's something that's ongoing, and if it works well, maybe something that I'll be presenting about through CTL in the future. So, all right, thanks very much. That's all I have. So back to David.
Thank you, Dr. Nolte. At this point, we can take a few questions or comments if there are any. You can use your microphone or the chat feature in the lower right corner of your screen if you have anything to mention.
I'm wondering about the Fishbowl method. If you could explain a little bit more on that, how to do it on Live Collaborate.
So on a Live Collaborate, the way that I would do it is, so you would assign the reading before the Collaborate session, and you would determine which students would be in the inner circle and which students will be in the outer circle. And if you want to get everyone engaged, what you could do is you could say to them at midway through the discussion, you're going to flip positions. So the students know that they need to identify questions they have about the, after reading the article, comments they think that are important to share with their classmates. And so you would have them come on the Collaborate and have the inner circle engage in this dialogue. And as the instructor, I might start it off by prompting a question that would be from the article or something about the article that they read that would allow the conversation, the dialogue to start. And then the students just pick up the discussion. And again, part of what they're having to do is listen to each other and also then ask follow-up questions, or perhaps they want to answer a question and then throw their question out to the group. So again, if you want everyone to participate, I would switch the, midway through the activity, have them switch positions. Does that help?
Yes, you're giving me ideas. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question.
Thank you both. Okay, at this time, let's, if you have further questions, additional questions, feel free to reach out to our guests or to us here at CTL. We're going to now begin to wrap it up, but I'd like to do so with a final poll. And I have three answers here for a question. Rate your level of willingness to try one of the recommended collaborative learning approaches in the near future. If you wouldn't mind logging your choices. Okay, thank you very much for your input. Looks like we have some positive feedback here, and we certainly encourage everyone to contact us here at CTL for help in designing, implementing, or contact our guests for the same thing with help for designing or implementing any of the approaches that you've seen here today. This concludes the audio portion of today's webinar. If you have questions after the webinar closes, please feel free to reach out to our guests or CTL. I want to thank you, send a big thank you to our presenters, Dr. Jenny Sue Flanagan and Dr. AJ Nolte. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for CTL's Creating Connections, Promoting Collaborative Learning webinar. Within 24 hours, you will receive both a link to the webinar recording and a feedback survey. We appreciate you taking the time to provide feedback. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody, and thank you again all for attending.